If you take a group of people with the right equity incentives and organize them in a startup, you can unlock human potential in a way never before possible.
So you need to foster the belief in what you are dreaming so that it becomes a reality.
Don't think about how do I get big fast. That will happen if you actually build something super meaningful.
There's a lot of energy, there's a lot of movement, but how do we connect it all together for the benefit of entrepreneurs and the ecosystem as a whole?
This is Opportunity Miami, a show about the entrepreneurs, civic leaders, and innovators who are solving the issues that will define Miami's economic future. I'm Matt Hagman. When we think about Miami's economic future, being a place that creates lots of new businesses is a key part of that future. Studies show that virtually all net new job growth comes from companies 5 years or younger. This, of course, means being a place that launches lots of high-growth tech companies, which we're doing better than ever in Miami. But it also means being a place that launches many micro and medium-sized businesses that may never be considered high growth, but employ countless people across our community. In many ways, this is a source of strength for our region. South Florida has more micro businesses per 100 people than any other region in the US. But what can be done to propel even more of them into the future? And what can government and policymakers do to help? We'll explore. Powered by the Beacon Council, this is Opportunity Miami. For more than 20 years, Victor Hwang has been a leader in ways to propel entrepreneurship and drive economic development across the country. He previously led Kauffman Foundation's entrepreneurship program, the largest philanthropy in the US supporting entrepreneurs. Most recently, he started Right to Start, a nonprofit that aims to help rebuild the American economy by making entrepreneurial opportunity available to all, from, as he puts it, the scrappy sidewalk vendor to renegade retailer, urban farmer to suburban maker, and everyone in between. And doing this work is especially focused on ways policymakers can make it easier for all people to start and pursue their entrepreneurial dreams. He joined us to share his ideas on where we go next.
Victor Hwang, welcome.
Thank you, Matt. Awesome to be here.
It's so great to be with you. Thank you for the time. You know, you've been working and supporting entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship for more than 20 years as a writer, as an advocate, as an ecosystem builder, and as a grant maker. In fact, you ran Kauffman Foundation's entrepreneurship program, the biggest of its kind in the country. But last year, you decided to do something different. You went back to your house and you launched a nonprofit, a national nonprofit called Right to Start. Why?
Well, with Right to Start, what I saw was this gap in the system, which is that every issue that matters in American life has some kind of advocacy infrastructure in place. There's some kind of movement behind it. And so if you believe in the right to bear arms, you've got the NRA. If you believe in civil liberties, you've got the ACLU. But if you believe that everybody fundamentally has a right to be entrepreneurial, to be able to start their own thing, to create a business, to control their economic destiny, where do you go? Who speaks for you? Who fights for you? Where is your voice heard? And so Right to Start really was launched to fill that gap. It's really an initiative to lift the voices of entrepreneurs, lift the voices of people who are currently voiceless in the system.
You know, big part of Right to Start is around policy. Government policies that can propel entrepreneurs and drive entrepreneurship, expand opportunity. And so often government officials, elected leaders ask, you know, what can I be doing to drive entrepreneurship and policy changes? And in fact, you've come up with field guides for both, whether it's local, state officials. Talk about what you see right now as the priorities that elected leaders, whether they're here in Miami or across Florida, should be thinking about and prioritizing.
Well, the thing about so much of policymaking and entrepreneurship is we've tended historically to treat it like like kind of a side issue. It's something where, you know, they'll give you like a little program to say, oh, we'll give you a little fund here or a little subsidy there or a little, you know, tax write-off there. But the thing about entrepreneurship is it's a 360 issue. Everything about public life and society actually affects entrepreneurship. So it's taxes, regulation, banking, capital access, education, workforce, economic development, patent policy, infrastructure issues, broadband issues. They all affect the ability of entrepreneurs to start and grow successfully. And so when we think about policy, it's not so much like a little side issue. It's actually a philosophical mindset on how we govern. And so a big part of what we've tried to do with Right to Start is to put forward a set of ideas and priorities that really are around how do you actually shape the system and actually tilt it in the right direction. So one of the things that people often don't realize is that the system tends to favor large incumbents as opposed to little startups. And when I say little startup, I mean not just the cool tech startup that's trying to become $1 billion, although that's certainly part of it, but it's someone building a business on their kitchen table or in their basement or in their garage, trying to make a go of it and trying to pursue the American dream in their own way. And so if you look at the system, 81% of entrepreneurs actually say the system is tilted in favor of large corporations and against little startups. It's a very high number. And so they can't all be wrong, right? There's really a fundamentally imbalance in the system. And so if you look at what we're doing with Right to Start, we've actually published a set of ideas under our field guide for policymakers that actually talk about here's how you do it. And they really look at how do you retilt the system back in a fair direction again. So when it comes to economic development, workforce, government contracting, educational systems, debt, healthcare, capital access, how do we actually shift it back? And so to get a level playing field, you actually have to tilt it, which is a correction to the system as it's evolved over several decades now.
And give us a sense of what some of those policy ideas are that you think that elected leaders, council members, commissioners, state legislators, that they should be enacting right now?
Well, the simplest idea and the simplest approach we have is what we call 5% to start. It's kind of like you know, when cities talk about 1% for the arts, which is a movement across the country for city budgets to allocate 1% for the arts. Well, 5% to start is something similar, which just says there's a lot of government systems that actually favor larger incumbent companies. What if we took just 5% of them and tilted them in favor of the entrepreneurs? And so where we look at doing that is government contracts. Can just 5% of government contracts go to new entrants, firms that have never won them before? It doesn't sound like it's much to ask for, but if you think about the way government contracting works, people who know the system, it's basically tilted in favor of the people that won it last time. So the companies that tend to win government contracts are the ones that won it last time, and the ones that won it last time are the ones that won it before. And so what we're saying with 5% to start is, why not just open up 5%? You can keep 95% of it to the folks that would have won it anyways, but if you could just crack open the door a little bit, the new innovative entrepreneurial firms will have a chance to get in that door and also provide more innovative services for their governments. And then economic development. Across the country, there's tens of billions of dollars spent on economic development. Almost all of it goes to support large corporations, particularly through incentives and attraction and retention subsidies. What if you took just 5% of that for the entrepreneurs? And 5% also for workforce training. Tens of billions of dollars a year, 20 billion out of the feds, and tens of billions of dollars from the states go towards workforce training. And so if we're trying to train the workforce of the future, what people don't realize is so much of our workforce systems actually are job placement skills. They're actually teaching people skills so they can get placed into large corporate jobs. Basically, they're job takers instead of job makers. So can we just shift 5% of workforce support systems to help people become job makers and not just job takers? And it sounds crazy, but that's actually the way our workforce systems are set up, is basically a 20th century industrial era economy where we're actually helping people fill corporate jobs through skills training, which is not inherently wrong, but we've tilted it so far in that direction that people are trying to get skills and learn how to create their own thing, don't get the same kind of support.
Now, we've also seen, of course, lots of activity in Washington in terms of federal legislation, the American Rescue Plan. That has things like the Build Back Better Regional Challenge, or we have things like the Good Jobs Challenge. And of course, more recently, we had the infrastructure bill, which has funding to significantly expand internet access. One sort of frame for us this moment, if this is different, if we are seeing more funding and more activity around supporting and driving entrepreneurship from the federal government. And two, how should we here in Miami, how should we be thinking about this?
Well, what we've seen in the data and the pandemic has exacerbated that, which is entrepreneurship has actually been in a state of crisis in this country for many decades now. So if you look at what's happened in entrepreneurship since the 70s, we've fallen by roughly half the entrepreneurial activity in this country as a proportion of the businesses in the economy.
Amazing.
And what happened during the pandemic is there was a spike in entrepreneurial activity, but a large chunk of those people were people doing it out of desperation because they saw their businesses shut down or their jobs get dislocated. But there's also a good chunk of people thinking, you know what, let me try something different. Let me actually see an opportunity and do something else. But what we haven't done is to actually figure out, well, how do we actually help them out? We're basically, people are trying to adjust. They're trying to realign themselves with what's happened over the pandemic. But we're actually at a moment where we actually haven't really responded as a society. What are we doing to support them? How is government playing a role in that? How is society reaching out to help people readjust their lives? We've basically got the same system today that got us into this mess in the first place with entrepreneurship. So we've got to tilt it back. And there's an opportunity now. If you look at the federal bills that have passed, there are parts of it that actually can be game changing. So there's one little provision, little is a $10 billion little provision within
That's so little.
The American Rescue Plan Act called SSBCI. It's an acronym that you can't pronounce, which actually stands for State Small Business Credit Initiative. But it's really interesting because it's the largest amount of money ever spent to try to boost capital access for entrepreneurs that haven't been able to get access to capital in at least a generation. And so we've got this moment right now where you've got $10 billion, which will be given from the U.S. Department of Treasury to the states, all 50 states and the territories and native tribes too, to actually figure out how can you create new capital systems to reach the entrepreneurs that were trying to start businesses and that couldn't get access before. The burden now is on the states and the localities that are trying to create the response to that and figure out how do you actually deploy that money effectively. But you've got these moments now, and I think the challenge is, are we rising to meet the moment? You know, we've got a significant chance to reinvent the way capital reaches entrepreneurs at state and local level. Are our state and localities really responding? And the fact that almost no one talks about this infusion of capital is a sign that perhaps we're not fully reaching the audiences we need to reach with this. Another huge opportunity, and this is in the infrastructure bill that was just passed, is the broadband access expansion. So there's $65 billion in there that are going to expanding broadband. And broadband, if you think about it, is the equivalent of electricity and water today. 100 years ago,
Sure.
It took a government infusion of capital to get electricity out to communities that couldn't get access to electricity. And we're kind of in a similar moment. There are people who still don't get high quality, high bandwidth access to the internet. And we can shift that.
So with this federal legislation, what have we seen in terms of making a dent in what have been really glaring inequities as it relates to entrepreneurship regarding entrepreneurs of color and women?
Well, the system is fundamentally flawed and biased. If you look at the data, it just bears it out. You really can't deny it. Black entrepreneurs start with 1/10 of the capital on average, and they grow at a fraction of the speed. Businesses started by women grow at half. They start with half their capital, and they grow about half the rate compared to businesses run by men. So you see businesses fundamentally on a different playing field. And so what's happening with a lot of this work you're seeing at the federal level and the state and local level is people realizing it's actually not good for all of us. It's not just about those people themselves. Communities as a whole actually can rise or fall depending on whether we're able to unleash all the talent and the capabilities in our ecosystem. And so this is sort of that moment right now is, are we going to leave money on the table as society where people aren't able to grow their businesses or make the full access and use of their talents, or are we going to include them in this world? And you're seeing increasing growth in expanding capital access to women and minority entrepreneurs, but it's starting from such a low baseline. You know, the amount of women and Black entrepreneurs that are able to get venture capital, for instance, is in the single digits. It's been slowly rising, but we're still talking minuscule amounts of capital that are available. And that applies not just to venture capital, but it also applies to banking. Black entrepreneurs get rejected for loans for businesses by 3 times non-Black entrepreneurs. And that's controlling for all other variables. So we know this is research that actually shows how unfair the system is. So we've got to actually do a lot better. And we've got an opportunity with programs like SSBCI and some of the other programs that people are trying to do to actually tackle that problem and make things better. But we've got a long ways to go.
So as it relates to the federal legislation, Washington isn't done, that there are other things percolating. What would you like to see prioritized as we move forward?
The priority really is, it's always a challenge to say that we're going to spend more money for more programs because with entrepreneurs, there's so many things they could use support with. But where I would see a huge opportunity is actually to take some of the existing systems that we have right now and shift them in favor of entrepreneurs. So government contracts, economic development, workforce. The government spends about $12 billion in workforce training. And right now, if a state, almost all states are like this, if you actually have someone go through workforce training sponsored by the federal government, and they actually start a business and it employs 10 people, for most states, that's considered a failure in workforce because that person didn't get placed in a job. We've got a system that actually does not reward starting and growing businesses and creating jobs. We've got a system that's actually stuck in the past where it's about placing people in existing jobs. And so things like that are huge. There are huge opportunities waiting right there, and they can actually be done with very little money down.
So oftentimes in talking about entrepreneurship, we talk about them almost as two worlds, small businesses and then high growth tech entrepreneurship. I mean, here in Miami, in such an effort around building the tech ecosystem, as we've seen in cities around the world. How do you think about this? Are these two different worlds or not?
Well, you're right. There is this disparity of, high tech, high growth businesses and all other businesses, like people call them Main Street businesses or mom and pop businesses or lifestyle businesses, which is I find to be kind of demeaning in a way when people call it that, because when people prejudge businesses, you're actually diminishing people's opportunity. If you look at the lines are blurred right now between what's a tech business and a non-tech business. Every business is a tech business today. Every business is tech enabled. You're using the tools of the modern economy. You're digital. Every business has to be digital and tech enabled to be able to even succeed in this world. And one example I think about, you mentioned I used to work at the Kauffman Foundation. Mr. Kauffman built one of the leading biopharmaceutical companies in America. By 1986, it was worth $6 billion, which is far more even in today's terms. And so what people forget, though, is in 1950, 36 years before that, he started selling health supplements from the back of his car. And so he started as a small business on the side, doing things that did not look like high-tech, high-growth businesses, but it eventually turned into a multi-billion-dollar company, and it transformed the nation and the world.
Just to pause on that for a second, because here in the Miami context, for example, we've talked a lot about how there's a lot of success around small businesses and people starting small businesses and being a highly entrepreneurial community, but Miami historically struggling with high growth. And so there's been a big push on building an ecosystem where people can scale ventures. If I hear you correctly, you're saying, you know what? Don't draw those distinctions. Support entrepreneurs, period.
Well, I think the distinction in terms of a business that's tech and non-tech, I think, is artificial in the sense that I think the real distinction is what are the skills people have that enable them to do their work better. And so if you're running a bakery, your ability to use the digital tools to manage your supply chains, to make your business run more efficiently, to do marketing, to reach customers, to do advertising, to be able to build a brand presence worldwide, you can do that now in a way that you could never do before. Every business can be a multinational from the get-go. What's missing is our own attitude. So if we're saying, well, you're just a little mom and pop business, that's what you're destined to do, then that's what they're going to be, because the society and the rest of us don't think of them any more than that, and we don't offer them the support and the skills and the resources it might take to grow. I think the issue is we have to think in terms of the raw skills and capacity that can turn things into anything. So I think about, for instance, Howard Schultz, who started Starbucks. I mean, in one sense, it was just a coffee shop.
Sure.
But I mean, what a coffee shop. And you can say the same thing for almost any kind of business that's been transformative. If you look at the businesses that have been huge wins in the last decade, they were in business industries that you would never have thought of would be tech industries before. They were in hotels and taxis and things like that, that are kind of non-innovative industries where they were able to bring in technology and transform them. And these businesses were not all super planned out and predictable. They were things that required lots of serendipity and experimentation. If you look into the stories of Uber, the original founders of Uber weren't even sure that they all wanted to run the company because they didn't want to be taxi dispatchers when they started. And so you never know where innovation is going to come from, and you've got to look at the skills and give people a chance and give these businesses a chance to pivot and adjust and grow.
As we think about economic development, can we say that all or virtually all net new jobs come from new businesses, period?
That is the data. They've looked at this data over about 2 decades. John Halterwanger at the University of Maryland has been measuring this data, and it shows that over the span of 2 decades in the American economy, almost all the net job growth in an economy comes from the young businesses under 5 years. That is, businesses that are older, actually either net zero or net negative. Especially in times of crisis, larger, older businesses tend to shed jobs and they don't recover them. And if you think about it, that actually makes sense. A larger, older business is in the business of getting leaner and meaner and more efficient. They're trying to make more money with fewer costs. And so older businesses tend to do that over time. The young businesses are the ones that create something new, innovative. You can charge higher value. You can actually create more energy and value around new product development. And so young businesses are where the job growth is coming from. But it's really interesting. When you listen to policy debates about jobs, you hardly hear people talk about entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial opportunity as a solution to job growth problems. But that's actually what the data shows. The data shows it's not the big companies that we turn to that are going to rescue job growth problems. It's actually going to be the new innovative businesses in serving markets and filling gaps that currently aren't being filled and served today. Super interesting.
Now, in terms of economic development, communities have been trying various things to drive economic development for years. How has it changed through the years, through your more than 20 years working in entrepreneurship? And how should it change as we look ahead?
Well, if you think about the way we do economic development, most places still are focused on hunting the Goliaths. They go after looking for Amazon HQ2 when it was creating its second headquarters, where 238 cities across the country offered tens of billions of tax incentives and subsidies for Amazon to build its second headquarters. Amazon promised 50,000 jobs over 5 years, but if you actually look at the data, entrepreneurs create far more jobs than that. So in Kansas City, for instance, where I'm based right now, entrepreneurs created 80,000 jobs over a 5-year period. But because there's no big ribbon cutting, there's no big celebration, there's no headline, those are jobs being hired one at a time from the little businesses. But over time, they add up. And so I think of it as the difference between Goliath and David. People focus on Goliath because he's the big giant. And David seems like a small little warrior, and you've got to get lucky throwing a sling to hit the giant. But what if you had 1,000 Davids? 1,000 Davids, 1,000 little businesses are actually more powerful and more effective than Goliaths. And so the way to create 1,000 Davids is to focus on the entrepreneurs, the people that are actually building these little firms that can actually grow into giants someday. And you actually control that in a community. You take the assets and the resources you have, and you unleash that. And that kind of unleashing is where the energy really comes from and where the jobs really come from.
You know, when you think about entrepreneurship and innovation today, what worries you?
I think this issue about entrepreneurship and the fact that entrepreneurship is largely ignored in our public debate, it's an invisible crisis, because we have an economy where the people and the technologies are racing into the 21st century, but we have a policy system and a governance system, and the rail guards on our economy are essentially designed for the 20th century, an industrial era. So I mentioned workforce, economic development, government contracting. Over time, our systems get ossified, they get older, they get more rigid, and they tend to favor incumbents and larger entities who have a voice in the system. And so what worries me most is that a society actually ages beyond repair and isn't able to get nimble again. And the way to do it is to be intentional about it. You've actually got to say, you know, we're going to focus on the little startups, the ordinary people trying to create new things that actually can become the giants tomorrow. We've got to favor them. We've got to tilt it in their direction because that's our seed corn. That's the future of our society. And if you don't do that, what happens? And this happens all over the world, which is the institutions get more rigid, the older companies get more entrenched in the system, and it's harder for the new players to break in. So you've actually got to open up the system or it doesn't open on its own.
You know, earlier you talked about entrepreneurship being in crisis and talking about how entrepreneurial activity is down. I think to many people that would be a surprise because, you know, with technology, with new companies that we weren't a part of our lives 10, 15 years now being, you know, a central part of our lives, and in fact, entrepreneurs being heroes, the likes of, you know, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, lionized for. Explain a little bit how we make sense of this, how on the one hand, it feels like with technology, some could think of it as a golden age of entrepreneurship, but in fact, what you're describing is very much the opposite.
It is interesting because a lot of people don't believe the data when you tell them that entrepreneurship has been declining, but then it's right there. The data stares you right in the face. And I think what's happened is we've lionized our entrepreneurs in America. We've made them out like idols, but we've actually turned entrepreneurship into this privileged activity for a few elites, and we've made it more intimidating for everybody else. So there are people who look at the great entrepreneurs of the last few decades in America and think, that's amazing. God, America's a great place, but I could never do that. And, you know, that just sounds too hard. And so we've unintentionally elevated entrepreneurship to the point where it seems unattainable for so many. And I think the thing about entrepreneurship, and I know this coming from an immigrant family, is that entrepreneurship should be as easy as breathing. It's one of the most natural human activities is to create something that didn't exist before, to fill a gap or to solve a problem that you see in the world, and to be able to sell it to people and make a living out of it and actually make the world better in doing so. It should feel like a very natural act. But right now it feels so hard. You actually have to work against the system. You actually have to fight against the current to actually try to build something new. And it shouldn't be that way at all. It should feel like a very natural thing. You know, my parents came to this country as immigrants. And I think a lot of folks in South Florida can identify with this, given that half the region is full of immigrants. But they came with $300 and 2 bags of laundry because they didn't have suitcases. They actually had to use canvas laundry bags. And they lived the American dream. They actually started a business to be able to afford to put me through college, which succeeded. And they put me through college and they were able to provide a retirement for themselves. So I've seen the power of entrepreneurship on people's lives, but I've also seen how hard it is. It doesn't need to be this hard. And I've talked to entrepreneurs all over the country and all over the world. And what's happened is I think we just make it too hard. We actually have stifled entrepreneurial activity, and we've made it hard for little people trying to do little things, ordinary people trying to do ordinary things, and turn them into elite, privileged, hard activities to do when it really doesn't need to be that way at all.
The world is, of course, changing fast due to technology. And as we think what's coming, whether it's the metaverse, Web3, crypto, I'm curious, this coming era, give it a name. What do you think we're in for?
If I had to create a name for the era, I think I would call it the ecosystem economy. And what I mean by that, and I wrote a book about this called The Rainforest, which is the idea that the economy is a natural system. It's like an ecosystem. And in an ecosystem, every little bit is important because it interacts with everything else. So everything is interconnected. Every person, every idea, every piece of value, every resource actually can be realized into something and has a role in the system. And so if you look at the old economy, it was, well, you're kind of a fungible commodity. You're kind of a widget in the system and you're replaceable. You can be fired from one job and we can replace you with someone else the next day. In an ecosystem, we're actually taking a different view, which is saying everyone's got talent, everyone's got capabilities, everyone's got dreams, everyone's got hopes. Let's find a system that actually makes the most of that, tap that and unleash that. And then you can actually experience the full power of all of society. You're not leaving people out. You're actually leveraging that full strength. And just like in a natural ecosystem, little things can start small and grow into great big things. And you never know what that's going to be in advance. You actually have to create a system that nurtures weeds and lets them grow up. because in a rainforest, in a natural ecosystem, a weed can become a great big company, can create tremendous value, can affect so many lives in so many ways. And we have to respect that. We have to respect that little things can provide tremendous value for the whole ecosystem.
You know, Victor, last question. Few people have written more about entrepreneurship, read more about entrepreneurship than you. Leave us with a book that you'd recommend about entrepreneurship.
You know, most people think I'd say, a book about startups or entrepreneurs, but I'm going to offer a book that's a bit different, which is a book about biology. It's by E.O. Wilson, or Edward Wilson, called The Meaning of Human Existence. And E.O. Wilson, who happened to be a former professor of mine, is considered the greatest biologist in history right after Charles Darwin. So really a huge influencer in biology. And the book he wrote is really his valedictory to the world in many ways, because he believes that what makes human beings special is our ability to come together to solve things together. So he talks about how campfires, when people could sit around and talk about what's the best way to get crops, or to get food, or to kill that woolly mammoth, or to protect yourself against that saber-toothed tiger, that our ability to form teams it differentiates us from every other animal species. Every other animal species, you're kind of locked into whatever you're born with. You are given a role in life, and that's your role, that's your family, that's your place forever. Human beings can say, you know what? What if we did that? What if we solved this problem? What if we filled this gap? What if we invented this new thing? And you know what? I'm going to build a startup or an enterprise and bring together the most talented people I can find around to do that. That ability to mix and match and to envision the future and to create new possibility is distinctly human. It actually sets us all apart. And the way you do that is by building environments where there's a high amount of trust and collaboration. And that's what makes human beings distinct, our ability to actually build trust, to form teams, to tackle problems together. That's both a strength and it's a potential weakness, because we can also form teams and fight against each other. But when we actually form teams and solve problems to tackle issues together that we need to tackle collectively, that's actually a huge source of power. And that's what E.O. Wilson says the field of biology is coming to. That's actually the realization of decades and decades of work in how human beings are biological creatures, is that we actually have this great power to work together and solve things together, unlike any other creature on Earth. And it's kind of time that we start to do that.
Victor Hwang, thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt Hagman. Thanks so much for everything you do, and thanks for having me here today.
Next time you're in Terminal D at Miami International Airport, be sure to stop in at Half Moon Empanadas. Started in 2008, CEO Pilar Guzman Zavela said it's a company that started as a dream, evolved into an idea, became a concept, and eventually a reality. Today, it has 12 locations and more than 70 employees, and it expects to surpass revenues of more than $7 million this year. But it hasn't been easy. In fact, it's been really hard. Pilar joined us to talk about her experience and ways to propel more entrepreneurs like her. Pilar Guzman Zavela, welcome.
Hi, Matt. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Good. It's so good to see you. Thank you. Wanted to start, right now, of course, tech is on fire in Miami, and it is so exciting. But wanted to ask you, should we be widening our lens too? That is, not all companies start out as tech companies, even as tech is becoming every part of our lives. Not all companies are venture-backed companies. And of course, we think of you and Half Moon Empanadas. So I'd love to hear how we should be thinking about this and approaching this as we think about entrepreneurship across Miami.
Yes, I think that's a great question. I think what's happening in Miami is beautiful, and we need to embrace all these efforts and the great interest that we're having from venture capitals and from, the tech sort of industry, right? So I welcome that. I think it's great. My little sort of 2 cents is that, we have to think about, the other industries, the non-tech sector, because today the economy in this city is not based on tech. And so I think my approach is always, how do we help the non-tech sector of the current industries in Miami, like mine, restaurants, hotels, the service industry. How do we use technology to support these other industries? So I think I do believe that the conversation should be a little bit more broad, but of course I'm biased.
Well, you've said before we need to think bigger and talking about entrepreneurship. Expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that I mean, from the school, from thinking from kids in school, how do we add entrepreneurship to school, right? Like from that little space to how do we support entrepreneurs in Miami? You know, what are the challenges? We're the number one city on startups, or among the top, and then we're among the last sort of cities to have companies scale. So we have to ask the questions: why is it that we're not able to grow our companies, right? And I always go back to my own experience, because that's all I can say is, what were the challenges or the things I had to overcome, that I think we should be focusing. And I always talk about access to capital, right? If you look at some reports in 2019, I think, funding capital for women companies was like less than 3%, and so the conversations about how we, open up for minorities, for small businesses, for Latinos, which is Miami, funding capital, right? So when we talk about investors for tech, can we talk about investors for other industries, right? So let's think broader. I think that, what I said about technology, how do we help entrepreneurs with technology? One idea that I have, and I put it out there, so whoever wants to get it, and bring it to life. But I was thinking, okay, so what does that really mean for a company like mine? And I was thinking, if I were to have the money to hire a chief technology officer for a year or for 6 months that could come into my company and kind of give me like a roadmap of, this is where you should be thinking, and these are the resources, and these are the systems that you should be putting in place, would be amazing. I mean, that's something that's like another language for us. So that's an idea right there. And I think I mentioned to you the procurement, right? Like, how do we get more entrepreneurs to participate in the procurement process of our big institutions, the airport, the educational system, the hospitals? Right there, you have plenty of things that we could do to support entrepreneurs.
So your Half Moon Empanadas was started in 2008, if I remember correctly. And
Yes.
And now you've grown it to 12 locations. You have over 70 employees. You have revenues this year of some $5 million, and next year expected to get up to $7 million. I remember you sharing a story previously about how you went, in terms of expanding, you didn't have a business where you could go to VCs for venture funding or go to angel investors. Instead, you were going to banks, seeking financing, seeking bank loans. And you went, as I recall, to 10 different banks before you got to yes. Talk about that journey and what ultimately unlocked it for you. And then maybe sort of expand on that as you think about the broader ecosystem of entrepreneurs like yours, but what we need to do to help them.
Yeah, I mean, for me as a Latina coming into this country and kind of understanding how to be an entrepreneur in America, just the basic thing of credit was something new for me. So that, as basic as that. So yes, we got the location in the airport. We won the bid, and we couldn't get financing for this contract that we won. And I went to 10 banks in Miami. So I did a master's degree in financing by rejections. And it was really thanks to a mentor from Knight Foundation, Juan Martinez, who I just said, and nobody wants to lend me money. Do you happen to know anybody? And of course, he knew people. And I sat down with the chairman of Total Bank back then. And right on the spot, I mean, it's like a story of the dreams, but right there on the spot, he heard the story, heard the plans for the location in the airport, and said, your financing is approved. Without that, how did I do the airport? Like, that was the only way. And so to me, that was a big, big learning. And I always talk about, how in Miami and in America, how do we build this pipeline where these tiny businesses that are not ready to go financing or get financed by a large bank, how do they start with the local organizations, with even the city, the local organizations that have a little bit of funds, $5,000, so that they teach you what is it that you need. So they kind of teach you, you get the money, and then you graduate step by step. So you go to a local bank, then you maybe go to a regional bank, and then you go to a larger bank. And I think that pipeline is what we haven't been able to create. So if I'm a small business and I go to a large bank, I don't get into the square box of banks. And so I think that is a huge disconnection in the system.
And something where we could leverage a real strength, because as you pointed out, we already have lots of micro businesses here in Miami. In fact, there was a recent report that said Miami has more than any other city in the country. But to your point is that how many more could there be? Because it was such a struggle, just even as you had this great opportunity at the airport to get that financing. So it sounds like access is one of the things we really need to be thinking about for entrepreneurs, for small business just getting started.
Yeah, access, and how do you make systemic this experience of mine of like getting this connection, right? Like, how do I get in contact with the chairman of the bank? How do you create a pipeline of opportunities for everybody to have access to? And I think this conversation it's part of that. So I commend you for that.
So earlier, Pilar, you talked about how, while your business, of course, didn't is focused on making incredible empanadas, which I always get when I'm in Terminal D at the airport or at FIU. But the focus was on great empanadas, right? It wasn't on tech. But you mentioned earlier how there are places where tech can really propel the business in meaningful ways. What are some examples of that?
Yeah, I think I can think of two different things, like the administration of the business, the back end of the house, like how do you manage information live, from the moment I get the chunk of steak to the moment that the empanada of beef is sold. So that sort of process of information is important, and technology can help with that. On the sales side, I'll give you an example. I've been with trying to build my website the correct way for a year with 3 different vendors. And so if I had somebody that could like guide me on that process, I'm sure that it would have been ready with less resources, quicker. I think the whole digital marketing space it's amazing, but it has very specific knowledge that you need to have. So it's like, do I focus on selling empanadas and growing the business? So, I think that sort of position of chief technology officer is something we need to think as companies, as entrepreneurs soon. But, it's expensive, right? So then what's the trade-off there?
Sure, absolutely. Well, if you had, and you've been on Zoom calls with President Biden, so you've spoken to many elected leaders. But if you were to be talking with a local elected leader right now, or let's add in a local business leader who really cares about growing small business and driving entrepreneurship of all kinds across Miami, what's the thing that you would say to them?
Please, put the focus. Your agenda has to be front page. The priority number 1 is, how do I support entrepreneurship in Miami-Dade? How do I think that one of the things that the administration did correctly when the crisis was focusing on small businesses, because those were the ones that were going to be able to move faster in the middle of COVID, right, in the crisis, versus the larger corporations. Miami, that's mostly what we are. We're small businesses. So I would tell them that, yes, we need to first put that as a priority, and then really maybe gather entrepreneurs, talk to entrepreneurs, like sit down with entrepreneurs that actually are doing the work and can tell you, hey, this is what I need in the space, and listen and put policies in place that can actually go to the needs of these entrepreneurs. I think that there is a big disconnection that talk directly to the entrepreneur, not the organization's entrepreneur.
Well, Pilar, thank you very much. We so appreciate the time and your insight.
Thank you, Matt. It's nice seeing you.
Great seeing you. Just as we continue to build a high-growth tech community in Miami, our future will also be driven by the creation of micro, small, and medium-sized businesses that may not produce our next unicorn, but will provide countless jobs and economic growth across our community. Continuing to think in new ways to develop policies and programs to foster this growth will be critical. We hope you enjoyed the program. Be sure to connect with us on social media, subscribe to our weekly newsletter, and of course, join us again next time for Opportunity Miami.